As the world watches King Charles take on his new role, few moments escape the public eye. But what unfolded recently left the entire country in shock. A seemingly private moment with a young lady, caught on camera, has sparked widespread disbelief. The leaked footage stuns the entire country. King Charles didn't know a camera caught him doing this. The grandeur of Buckingham Palace was overwhelming. Grace Andrews had been ecstatic when she got the call confirming her role as a junior assistant to the palace staff. But walking through the opulent halls, every gleaming chandelier and centuries-old painting seemed to whisper, "What are you doing here?" She couldn't get over her nerves, but she was about to get a huge surprise during a private moment with King Charles. Grace had been praised for her poise and professionalism during the hiring process, but the reality of the job was sinking in. Every task felt like walking a tightrope, where the smallest misstep could send her tumbling. The constant murmur of clipped instructions from senior staff and the rigid protocols of palace life were more intimidating than she had anticipated. The young blonde woman who had always prided herself on her adaptability now felt like a fish out of water. She tugged at her dress, feeling more uncomfortable than ever. She'd spent days agonizing over what to wear for every shift of her first week to make the right impression. She'd gone with her interview dress as the bright color made her smile, and she'd even received compliments on it during the interview. But now even this felt like the wrong choice. Was it professional enough? Was it too bright or too tight? It just felt like another mistake she'd made, and Grace couldn't help feeling like that list was getting longer. On this particular morning, her hands trembled as she attempted to arrange an assortment of fresh-cut flowers in a crystal vase. She had been tasked with placing them in the king's private study, a job usually reserved for more seasoned staff. But winter illnesses had hit the palace, and everyone else was busy covering more important jobs for those who were absent. The weight of the responsibility pressed heavily on her. One wrong placement could be perceived as a lack of attention to detail, and Grace was terrified it might cost her the position she had worked so hard to secure. "They're just flowers," she told herself. But deep down, she knew that nothing in this place was just anything. It would only take one of the more senior members of staff to notice that they hadn't been arranged in the usual way, and Grace feared she'd been pulled up on it. However, soon found herself actually enjoying the task of flower arranging. There was something calming and peaceful about it, compared to the other tasks she had. As she carefully thought about where each stem would go, her mind turned to the kind of bouquet she'd selected for her upcoming wedding day. She wasn't sure it would be as grand as any of the bouquets in the palace, but she still smiled to herself. As she became more lost in the task, she began to gently sway, her feet mapping out a small routine on the floor. Her thoughts were fully on the wedding now, and her mind had turned to the first dance. As she adjusted a rose for the third time, her feet elegantly swept across the floor. Suddenly, a voice forced her to stop. "Beautiful flowers, aren't they?" "Much like your dancing," the voice chuckled. Grace gasped and spun around, her heart racing. She'd been sure she was all alone in this room. Standing in the doorway, dressed in a tailored suit with an unassuming air that somehow magnified his presence, was King Charles. Her breath hitched. She had seen him from afar but had never expected to encounter him alone. She'd been sure that her job, low down the ranks, would keep her far away from the monarch. She curtsied quickly, nearly losing her balance in her nervous state. "Your Majesty," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd been shown what to do, should she ever encounter the king around Buckingham Palace, but all her training seemed to leave her brain at the sight of him. She had no idea if she'd curtsied correctly, or if she was supposed to speak to him, or just politely make her exit. "Great," she thought to herself. "Another thing I've got wrong." The king smiled, a warm, genuine smile that seemed to dissolve some of the tension in the air. "Please, no need to look so frightened. I don't bite," he said lightly, his tone kind but measured with a hint of a chuckle. Grace felt her cheeks flush. She wanted to respond, to say something intelligent or even coherent, but her voice failed her. Was it so obvious that she had no idea what she was doing? She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. So far, she'd contributed nothing to the conversation, but what was she even supposed to say to the king? Surely it was rude to ignore him. But what would the senior staff think about her having a conversation with him? King Charles stepped further into the room, his attention briefly drawn to the vase she had been arranging. Ah, roses and lilacs, a classic combination. Did you choose these? No, Your Majesty, Grace managed, her words tumbling out clumsily. I was just arranging them. Her eyes darted back to the vase and the flowers, and she couldn't help thinking about the shoddy job she'd done. The palace was full of beautiful bouquets, and hers was the worst-looking one by far. He examined the bouquet with a thoughtful expression. Well, I must say, it's a fine arrangement. May I ask if you were practicing your dancing for anything in particular? Grace blinked, her nerves momentarily giving way to surprise. Was he complimenting her on work she assumed was terrible? Maybe he was just being polite. Thank you, Your Majesty, she said, her voice steadier but still disbelieving. It's my wedding in a few months. I guess the flowers just reminded me of what I have to look forward to, so I was practicing for my first dance. The king motioned for her to come closer. He noticed her hesitancy to do so. You seem nervous. I can assure you nothing bad will come of you being asked to take a moment with me, he observed, his tone gentle but perceptive. These first days in new roles can feel daunting, can't they? Grace hesitated but eventually nodded. Surely the king had never felt nervous about anything, and the two of them practically had nothing in common. There was no way he could relate to how she was feeling. Yet she felt herself relaxing a little in his presence. He seemed to have an ability to put her at ease. Suddenly she found herself wanting to tell the truth. Yes, Your Majesty. I want to do everything right. I don't want to let anyone down. King Charles regarded her with a thoughtful expression. When I was younger, I often felt the same way. There's a certain weight that comes with wanting to meet expectations, isn't there? Grace nodded again, her eyes wide as she listened. She hadn't expected him to be so human, to have the same feelings and fears she had. And yet, he continued, I've learned over the years that it's not about being perfect. It's about doing your best, with sincerity and care. The rest tends to fall into place. She felt her shoulders relax ever so slightly. The words resonated deeply, like a soothing balm for her frayed nerves. She'd never looked at it that way. She assumed that everything she did in the palace had to be perfect right away. It never crossed her mind that everyone here, the king included, had learned important lessons over the years, that they'd perfected their skills by pouring time and care into everything, not because they could get things right the first time. They were all passionate about their roles, just as she was, and that was the most important thing, not perfectionism. What neither of them realized was that a discreet security camera, positioned in the corner of the room, had been recording the exchange. Its purpose wasn't intrusive. It was part of standard palace protocol to ensure safety. But the footage, capturing the king's unguarded kindness, would later stun the entire country and leave them in awe. Charles had gotten used to the security cameras around the place, so much so that he'd stopped noticing them. He had no idea that the camera had caught him doing this. Grace, on the other hand, didn't even know of their existence. If she had, she would have never positioned herself this close to the king. But her ignorant bliss to the camera would be a blessing in disguise. King Charles turned to Grace, coming closer. You know, he said, his voice carrying a thoughtful tone, this palace has seen centuries of people walk through its halls, each with their own doubts, their own struggles. You're no different from them. And yet, you're here. That says something about your abilities. Wouldn't you agree? Grace felt a lump in her throat. No one had ever framed it that way for her. I suppose it does, Your Majesty, she said softly. She'd never imagined she'd be getting some of the kindest advice she'd ever had from the king himself. The whole thing felt surreal. But it was what the king did next that took her completely by surprise. Standing right next to the young woman, he offered his hand. I would be more than happy to rehearse your dance with you. He smiled. Grace tried not to stare at Charles in complete shock, but before she could doubt her choices, she found herself accepting his offer. She was surprised to find that the king was actually a very good teacher when it came to dancing, and he politely corrected a few of her steps and her positioning. When the dance was over, the king moved away and smiled. "I'm sure you will have the most perfect first dance," he told her. Grace nodded, a small smile finally gracing her lips. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Truly." The king gave a slight nod, as though what they'd just done was as casual as discussing the weather. Then, with a twinkle in his eye, he added, "Now, about that vase, might I suggest turning the roses just a touch to the left? It brings out the symmetry." Grace laughed, a sound that surprised even herself, as she walked over to the vase to join the king. She adjusted the flowers as he suggested, and to her astonishment, the arrangement did look better. But her mind was still occupied by thoughts of dancing with the king. She paused, recalling one of the things she knew about the king. He was a keen gardener with a love for flowers. It was one of the reasons there were so many bouquets around the palace. It dawned on her that not only had he given her some sound advice about tackling her nerves, but his suggestions about the flowers came from a place of knowledge too. However, it was his advice about the dance that meant the most to her. It was a little bit of wisdom that she could take into her wedding day. She smiled, feeling grateful for everything she had learned during her short time with King Charles. As he left the room, Grace felt a newfound sense of calm. The king's words and his unexpected warmth had transformed her apprehension into a lesson in confidence. She assumed it was a private moment between the two of them, but a few days later she got a huge shock. Days later, when the footage of their interaction emerged, without any intrusion on her privacy, it quickly went viral. The clip, showing him patiently teaching a young staff member to dance, was hailed as a true show of his character. Grace's first thought was of the potential repercussions that may come from being that close to the king, but as she saw the kind comments and the way people around the country were just as stunned as she had been, she sensed that she had nothing to worry about. Many guessed that the young woman was soon to be married, and that the king had simply offered to give her a dance lesson. For the first time since accepting the position, she went to work with a sense of calm and a belief that she was more than cut out to do her job. The morning of the leaked footage turned out to be surprising for Grace in more ways than one. As she planned out her day, she was stunned to see a new task on her rota for the day: flower arranging. She smiled. She had a feeling that her interaction with King Charles had something to do with this new addition to her tasks, but it was one she was excited about. Rather than be faced with the hostility she'd feared in light of her personal moment with the king, Grace found herself embraced by the other members of the staff. They offered advice and tips, and she quickly realized that this had nothing to do with the king. They'd been like this all along, but her nerves had stopped her from seeing it. She'd taken their advice as criticisms before, but now she understood they were only trying to impart their wisdom and give her the best opportunities. When they weren't all busy with their duties, many of the senior members of staff took the time to ask her about her wedding. She suddenly found herself feeling very grateful to be part of such a wonderful team, and she knew that not a day would go by when she wasn't thankful for her interaction with the king. Not only had he given her confidence in her job, but he'd changed her entire way of thinking and made her even more excited for her wedding day. The entire country marveled at the simple, human moment between the monarch and his staff. For Grace, the experience was life-changing. It reminded her that even in the most intimidating circumstances, kindness and understanding could bridge gaps and ease fears. It also taught her to believe in herself more. Of course, the advice about dancing was helpful too. As for King Charles, he carried on with his duties, perhaps unaware of just how deeply his actions had touched those around him, including a young woman in a pink dress who no longer doubted her place in the palace or worried about her first dance. Now it's over to you. What do you think of this story? Have you ever been offered advice that has made you feel more confident? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.